but that's okay. Thank you very much for that, Dan. That was great. And you kind of led right into this. So I don't want to just kind of summarize my book, which is a little bit boring. What I want to talk about instead is how these two problems we're facing today are interrelated. So today the U.S. is basically carrying out two different kinds of wars. I'm not going to say two wars because there's way more than two wars. One is the ongoing wars that the U.S. is carrying out on poor peoples in other countries. We know about some of these drone strikes in Pakistan, troops still in Afghanistan, and the longest war in U.S. history, if you leave aside the wars against the Indians, which people always forget. The bombings in Iraq and Syria, sending more troops to Iraq again, not to mention U.S. support for brutal governments all over the world, from Israel to Honduras to Mexico, you name it. So this is one type of war. The other is the ongoing war against mostly black people in this country, carried out under the label of the war on drugs. And I'm calling it a war on purpose. Of course, there are other people who get caught up in this than black people, white people, Latinos. But this is fundamentally a war aimed against the black population. And it has been going on in one way or another for hundreds of years. Neither of these wars is a mistake, and neither of them is a result of the specific policies of politicians. Bush, Obama, Rahm Emanuel, Republicans and Democrats. Both of these wars have been going on under both types of politicians for a long, long time. Both are driven by the system we live in today. Violence has been at the root of capitalism since it was born. And I don't think capitalism can exist without that ongoing violence, aimed against people in other countries and aimed against people in the rich countries where the capitalists also live. And in fact, the two institutions which carry out these wars, which are the military and the police, were both created from the beginning in order to control the population, in order to control people who did not want to be controlled, or just kill them, which I'm going to get to in a second. So I want to talk about the origins first, and then I want to take it to today. Now, in the US, let's start with the military. The first military forces in the US were militias created in the New England and Virginia colonies. What were they created for? They were created to carry out genocide against Native Americans. That's the very origin of the militaries in this country from the 1600s on. In the 1640s, you already have a genocidal war carried out against the Pequots in Massachusetts. In the 1670s, you have another genocidal war carried out against the people who did, the descendant of the Indians who we had the first Thanksgiving with King Philip's War. And from that point forward, these wars have accelerated one after another until more or less the whole native population of the continent was either killed off or forced into concentration camps, which were called reservations. So why did the U.S. carry out these wars? So one of the main reasons was to extend the area which is available for slave plantations in the beginning. And it was, second of all, to extend the area open for U.S. capitalist investment. You know, people lived here in Chicago, and they don't live here anymore, and where are they? Well, it's the military that pushed them out, and it was created to do that. So if we're going to talk about what the military was used for, then we have to talk about what it was for from the beginning. Now, obviously, the U.S. military carried out wars against other big countries, too. But even if you look into these wars in a little bit of depth, they have a similar goal underneath them. If we go back to the first wars, like the American Revolutionary War, one of the main things driving the American Revolutionary War was that the British wanted to keep the American colonists east of the Appalachian Mountains. And the colonists wanted to extend across the Appalachians into Ohio and into the southeast, partially so they could extend slave plantations. The richest man in America, $1 bill. I don't use money, I just use credit cards because I don't want to use those guys. You know, see their pictures. Anyway, George Washington, right? He was the richest man in America at the time of the American Revolution, and he got rich partially by having big slave plantations, and partially by being a land speculator on lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, which he wanted to gain control over, and this is part of the reason why he joined the American Revolution and pushed for independence from Britain. So this war is not obviously just about extending the area under the control of the slave plantations. It's not just about the American colonists wanting to kill off more Indians, but that's a big part of the motivation, even for the American Revolution. The same is basically true of the War of 1812. It's true certainly for the war that the U.S. carried out with Mexico. One of the main motivations for the war with Mexico was that Texas became independent. Why did the Texans become independent? It was essentially illegal immigrants from the U.S. who went to Mexico, brought their slaves, and Mexico wanted to abolish slavery, and they said, oh, we're going to make a revolution to defend slavery against Mexico. Created this new country called Texas, joined it with the U.S. The U.S. joined them, and then carried out another genocidal war. And they then created one of the early police forces, proto-police forces in the US. Some people think the worst team name in American society today is the Washington Redskins. But I actually think the Texas Rangers is a more racist name, because the Rangers are an institution that was created to kill off the Indians and Mexicans that lived in Texas. It'd be like if you called the Frankfurt soccer team the Frankfurt SS. People would be up in arms. But the Rangers, oh, it's fine. Anyway, so I think that these, the origins of the military are important to understand, and the origins of police forces are important to understand when you're talking about it. This is where the military comes from. Now, I want to talk about the two good wars in American history, what people talk about as the two good wars, which are the Civil War and World War II. Okay? When we talk about the Civil War, I have to say that I'm on the side of the North in the Civil War. Okay, the slaves get freed. It took a war to do so. But that's not the same thing as saying that the war was fought in order to free the slaves. The North didn't fight the war for that reason. It fought the war in order to gain control over the national government and gain control over the West. Now, the slaves themselves took advantage of the war to gain their own freedom. They joined the US military and turned it into an army of liberation and used that military to serve their own purposes. But even that doesn't change the fundamental purpose for which people in Washington were fighting the war. And World War II is a similar case. I mean, I'm glad the Nazis are defeated, don't get me wrong, which, by the way, was not mostly done by the US military anyway. Nonetheless, that's not why the US got into the war. The US got into World War II in order to extend US power over the Pacific in particular. The US gets involved in the war because of its conflict with Japan, which people now have kind of forgotten because all the movies are about fighting the Nazis. So even in these cases, I think the role of the US military in the world is not to spread democracy. It's not to fight evil dictators, even if they sometimes do fight evil dictators. It is to spread the power of American capitalism. Now, since World War II, this has become even more obvious. The military is always being sent abroad with the excuse that it's going to spread democracy or to fight communism. Okay, I probably don't need to say to people why that's sort of obviously a lie. First of all, right, communists disappeared and the war has continued. Second of all, half the people the US allied with were not Democrats, more than half, way more than half. They talk about the European countries, which are the rich countries, which were kind of democracies as much as the US is. Although, in fact, when the US allied with them and called them democracies, they had huge colonial empires. The US says, we're defending democracy in England against the communist Soviets. Okay, but the 35 to 50 million people in England, I don't know the population in 1945, ruled how many hundreds of millions of people who had no vote in India and Africa, and they fought how many wars to try to defend their colonial empire. So even in this case, how is the US defending democracy of England? But to take it further, who does the US actually support around the world? It supports Diem in Vietnam, it puts in place Mobutu in Congo, the list goes on and on and on. Now, the US says that they're fighting all these wars against Islamic fundamentalism, which I think is equally a lie. Look at who the US allies with in all these wars. First of all, the US allied with Osama bin Laden, as everybody here is, I'm sure, familiar with. And then now, who is the US allying with in Iraq? It's allying with various different groups of fundamentalists against other groups of fundamentalists in an attempt to impose stability on the country. So the military was not founded to protect democracy. It was not founded to protect us. It was founded to use violence to protect and promote the interests of American capitalism. Now, many people think that the story of the police is fundamentally different from that, but I would beg to differ. I think the story of the police is actually extremely similar. It's an armed force organized in military lines that from the beginning was used to control the population. The first police forces in US history came out of the slave patrols in the South. I don't need to explain that. But let's talk about Chicago for a minute, which is what I know the most about. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But let's say, first of all, before the 1840s, there were no police forces anywhere in the US. In the North, basically the population controlled itself through elected constables, elected sheriffs, who were usually small farmers themselves, who lived around the people who they policed. But they didn't patrol them, they didn't have a beat. They probably had a gun because everybody had a gun. But they weren't particularly more military than the average population. They could raise a posse if they needed to have people help them track down somebody. But they were nothing like the police forces we have now. They maybe had a badge, but they absolutely did not have uniforms. And in fact, most of the time, they didn't even have a badge. And if you can see this in the early history of the US, if you read about the early history of the US, you have many cases where there are these big riots, or there's, for instance, in the American Revolution, crowds basically disassemble the house of the governor of Massachusetts. His name was Thomas Hutchinson. They spend all night doing it. No police show up to stop them because there were no police. Okay, so how do we get the police? We get the police as a wage labor system developed. And this is because, as probably everybody in this room knows, having a job basically sucks. Nobody wants to have a job. People wanted to have their own small business. Whether that small business was a farm, a blacksmith's shop, whatever. You know, a shop where you're selling, dry goods. This is what most people did until the development of industrial capitalism, and most people got sucked into being wage laborers. And, as people in this neighborhood certainly know, a lot of these wage laborers in Chicago from the beginning were German and Irish in the 19th century. These German and Irish people showed up, and they were outside that personal version of control that existed in the early US history. And they lived in their own neighborhoods. And they were people who didn't have much of a stake in the society. And this really scared the wealthy people who ran the city. And it was a reaction to that fear that they started to form the police force. The first big riot in Chicago history is called the Lager Beer Riot, the best name for a riot in history. Maybe it'd be better if it was like the Porter Beer Riot or the Scout Beer Riot, I don't know. But anyway, it was the Lager Beer Riot. And what happened was that a nativist mayor was elected in Chicago, and he tried to ban Sunday drinking. But this is a big deal because that's people's only day off. So he arrested a bunch of saloon keepers using not even really a modern police force. It was like 80 men who he hired who were politically linked to him. And then the Germans rioted, not something we usually associate with Germans, but in this case the Germans did, to free their saloon keepers. Yeah. Exactly here. So they rioted to free their saloon keepers, they had a big fight, and it's in the aftermath of this riot that the police are formed. And the police developed over the next 40 years, really in reaction to a rising labor movement. In 1877, there's a huge railroad strike all over the country. It shuts down Chicago, and in this city, the police managed to put it down, but it's a very close thing. Immediately afterwards, the wealthiest business people in Chicago formed a club. They met, they got together, they donated money to the police to buy, among other things, rifles, artillery pieces, and Gatling guns. Gatling guns, yeah. So, and then they formed an association called the Citizens Association, and a little bit later a club called the Commercial Club, which were clubs of rich people that tried to push the city government to remove the police from the control of elections. If you notice, we don't elect constables anymore. There's this huge militarized police force, which Dan described has this over $1 billion budget, which we don't get to vote on. It's like completely removed from electoral politics, and this is exactly what the wealthy people of Chicago in the late 19th century decided to do consciously. In 1886, you have the Haymarket Affair, which I'm not going to summarize, but in the aftermath of this affair, where some police are blown up, and where there's a huge strike for the 8-hour day, the police create the first Red Squad, which tracks down radicals, arrests them basically for nothing, smashes their printing presses, forces later radical meetings to wave the American flag and salute the police under threat of arrest. And also, they get another huge influx of cash from the rich people, who buy them an army base north of the city, not just for the police, but for the army. They think the police might get overwhelmed by the next round of strikes, we better have the army here just in case. Right there, you have the connection. This is called Fort Sheridan. A few years later, when you get the Pullman strike, the army occupied Chicago, and those soldiers are sent from Fort Sheridan. And of course, the rich people also donate money to build armories all over the city, some of which you can still see. These armories are not built in case there's an Indian attack. They're not built in case the Canadians invade Illinois. They're built to defend the city from its own workers. So I think these origins are super important. This is what the police were founded to do, control the population. Now let me fast forward a little bit, because today the police are mostly aimed against the black population. And that happened in a series of stages, starting with the Great Migration, which was a great migration of black people to the north during World War I, which was then repeated during World War II and continued really into the 70s. Okay, from that point forward, the black population was the most exploited section of the working class. The last hired, the first fired. People here, I'm sure, know all that story in its general outlines. There's a moment in the black movement in the 60s, 70s, 50s, when things open up, when there's a big struggle, when the oppression is thrown back to a certain extent for a certain time, when jobs are opened up, when people make a huge fight for it, when there's more money for schools, when there's more money for social programs. But at the same time that the black movement is winning those things, there's also an increase in repression. And a huge number of people were killed at the end of that movement. We all know about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, but the list goes way deeper than that. There's the murder of Fred Hampton on the West Side, countless other people in the Black Panthers, the COINTELPRO program, which is started by the FBI, which was partially just aimed at breaking up radical organizations like this one. This kind of culminates with the suppression of Attica, right, which I'm sure people kind of know about, where there's a prison rebellion, some guards were taken hostage in upstate New York, and the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, ordered the state police to go in and just massacre people, and they shot the guards as well as the prisoners to send a message: keep the movement going and you're going to get shot. And it's in this context that the war on drugs is launched. Let me start by saying the war on drugs is not about drugs. It's not about drugs. I'm going to give you the best piece of evidence for this. I grew up in Vermont, partially. Vermont is full of white people who use a lot of drugs. They don't go to jail. They don't go to jail. The town I grew up in Marlboro, Vermont, has about 600 people. I can guarantee that right now half of them are stoned. But there are no police patrolling the roads. There's no streets, right? They're not driving through the woods, like knocking on people's doors and pulling them out. No. In my high school, I could buy any drug I wanted. I wasn't a big druggie, but whatever. I could buy any drug I wanted. I knew where to buy it from. High school kids. How many of them went to jail? One. One of them did go to jail. But nonetheless, in general, they didn't go to jail. Why not? Because that's not who the police were aimed at. Every study shows that white, middle-class people use drugs at the highest rate. Look right now, in the Chicago area, where is there an epidemic of heroin, of people dying of heroin overdoses? In the suburbs, in Naperville. I teach at College of DuPage. And out there, I have students who tell me crazy stories about the number of their classmates who die from heroin overdoses. It's a real scourge. But they're not getting arrested in huge numbers. Who do they arrest? They arrest the black guy on the West Side, who at one point in the long chain of how the drugs got to Naperville, right, so had some involvement in it. That's who goes to jail. That's who the war on drugs is aimed against. Now, it's really a war to get the dangerous classes, which is the young black men, who today they see as the biggest possible threat, who are the ones who organized that movement not so long ago, off the streets. And it's been very effective. And we see in this city that it's happened in one wave after another. In the 80s, they called them sweeps. In the 80s, they arrested about 100,000 black men for what they then called disorderly conduct. And there was a bit of an uproar about it. Then in the 90s, they passed that infamous, at the time, gang loitering ordinance. I remember this because I just moved to Chicago when they passed this, which was the right to arrest people for hanging out on a corner. Okay? And they arrested, again, hundreds of thousands of people for it. And today, it's the Chicago version of stop and frisk, which Dan mentioned earlier. Now, going along with all this, of course, is an economic crisis, which we're living through still. More unemployment, attacks on the working class generally, cuts in all kinds of social programs. All the things that people won in that movement in the 60s and 70s are being eaten away. Why? Well, it's in order to hand over more money to the same people who created the police and the military in the first place. Look at where the federal budget deficit has come from. It doubled with the bailouts to the banks, which everybody somehow forgot about. Okay, so I want to give a couple of facts about this, which you guys are probably familiar with. To give one, last summer, the Chicago police, according to the ACLU, carried out 250,000 stops that did not lead to an arrest. In half of them, the cops couldn't even give an excuse for the stop. They were supposed to fill out a card saying, this is why we stopped this person. Half of the cards had no reason, and most of the other half had some kind of BS reason, like suspicion of drug use. Okay? Of the people that they stopped in a city that is less than one-third black, 72% of the people that they stopped were black. So that's why disproportionate numbers of black people, way out of any kind of reasonableness, are sent to prison for drugs. 70% of people stopped. They're going to find some people who have some drugs on them. And then these people get sent to prison. What's the point of the prison system? It is not to rehabilitate anybody. It's not to punish people. It's not to stop people from using drugs. It's really to brutalize people, and that's what it does. People are sent, not only do we have the largest prison population in the world, people are sent to prison for longer times, for smaller offenses, with fewer programs in the prison, with more brutal treatment of prisoners in this country, like solitary confinement, all kinds of physical and psychological abuse, which are carried out every single day. And people are also pled into the prison. Most of the people in prison never were tried with a crime. I'm going to give one example from a student of mine who worked as a nurse in Kane County Jail. Kane County is full of white people. She said, most of the people in jail are black. I said, why? She gave me an example. This guy, 17 years old, 18 years old, driving a car, pulled over by the cops, black kid. He had his mother's Vicodin in the car because she had had a tooth pulled. Vicodin is a prescription drug. He's charged with transporting a controlled substance. And they lock him in a room and basically intimidate this kid into pleading guilty. And they threaten him with 20 years, and he pleads out to 3 years for having his mother's Vicodin in the car. And then when he freaks out, my student was a nurse, she said he started freaking out, and they strapped him to a restraint chair, which didn't let him move for 24 hours. And when he still wouldn't calm down, her job was to inject him with drugs to make him basically pass out. And that's what's happening. You can imagine that's Kane County. What do you think is happening to the 10,000 people in Cook County Jail right now? Now, what are the other consequences of this? For one thing, if you come out of prison with that kind of record and that kind of abuse, what kind of job are you going to get? And what about voting? This is a crazy part. In 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, 1.5 million, approximately, black people were barred from voting by Jim Crow laws. 1.5 million. Today, 5 million are barred from voting because of a criminal conviction. That's crazy, 3 times as many. And then you also see, I don't know if anybody here saw that New York Times study about all the missing black men in the society. To give you another crazy statistic, in 1980, not so long ago, at least it doesn't seem so long ago to me, 14% of black children in the US were raised in a single parent family, mostly women. Today, the number is 67%. Why? It's a war against the black population. You lock up that many men, and what do you expect to happen? And people come out hardened. And this, I think, contributes to all these police killings. Because, of course, the police are right when they think there's some dangerous people on the streets. Yeah, because they created them. I want to give a quote from Michael Brown's mom. Michael Brown was the young man who was killed in Ferguson. She said, "You took my son away from me. Do you know how hard it was for me to get him to stay in school and graduate? Do you know how many black men graduate? Not many. Because you bring them down to this type of level where they feel like they don't have anything to live for anyway. They say they're going to try to take me out anyway." That's exactly right. That's exactly what they did to him, and to many others. Just in the last 7 years, in reports you can find in the news media, 2,000 black people were estimated to have been killed by the cops. And by the authorities' own admission, at least 1/4 of them were unarmed. Over 100 were women and at least 10 were children. And of all those killings, out of 2,000 killings, less than 30 cops were charged with anything. 2 were convicted of murder, and one of those, after being convicted of murder, was only put on probation in New York City. Of course, the system defends the cops that it sends to control the population. That shouldn't be really a surprise. I'm going to give an example which is on the newspaper over there of Rekia Boyd, which you guys have heard of. She was shot by this cop named Dante Servin. He thought he saw, supposedly, somebody pull a gun in a crowd standing in front of an alley. Although they all had their backs turned to him. It turned out to be a cell phone. He shot from his car over his shoulder and shot this young woman, Rekia Boyd, 22 years old, in the back of the head and killed her. This was such a crazy case, and her family raised a big fuss, so they felt like they had to prosecute him. They charged him with involuntary manslaughter. And the judge let him out, said he can't be tried again, and said the problem was it was murder, but he's only charged with involuntary manslaughter, so they had to let him go. So the judge admitted it was murder and let him go because of it? Do you think that would happen if he was a 20-year-old black man who'd killed a cop? I mean, you can't even imagine such a thing. This is simply the system defending its own. So, I want to conclude by saying this is not a question of a few racist cops, although of course they're racist cops. It's a question of what the cops are sent to do and what their fundamental role is in the society. The system needs violence. It needs violence at home and abroad to maintain itself. It's a system that has been, from its beginning, rooted in violence. And from the beginning, this violence has fallen more heavily on black people in this country. When people fight back, when they raise hell, when they cause problems, it's possible to get someone like Michael Slager, the North Charleston cop who murdered Michael Scott, charged. But we should have no illusions that this system, which always has been based on violence and exploitation, will somehow police itself. It won't. The wars at home and abroad are caused by the same system that's cutting money to schools and social programs while handing over ever more to the banks and the corporations. It's the same system that has systematically lowered the standard of living of working people in this country of all races over the last 40 years. And I think it will take a big fight against all these issues. That's why I worked on Ed Hershey's Working Class Fight campaign. I gotta give him one more call out. But it's gonna take a lot more than that, right? I think we have to know what we're up against. And that's much more than a handful of racist cops. It's a system that's fundamentally based on exploitation and violence, and that has sent these cops to keep the population, that is us, in line.
We have time for questions.
Any comment on for-profit prisons?
I think there's actually an interesting thing there, because I think that the prisons are all for profit. Because if you look at the prisons that are not for profit, in Illinois most of the prisons are not for profit, and most of the prisoners are in state-run institutions, but they find a million ways to hand money to the corporations anyway. I don't think what fundamentally drives the system is that the corporations want to send people to jail in order to get money out of it. I mean, there's that one case in the Michael Moore movie where the judge was corrupt and was sending people to private prison to get a bribe. But I don't think that's the fundamental problem. I think it's much deeper than that. I think it's really about keeping people under control. But of course the corporations wanted to suck money out of every element of the society they can. The one that got me was in Michigan last year, in Ohio, where they had, I think it was Aramark, serving food to the prisoners, and it had maggots in it, and these were state-run prisons. But of course they have all these private corporations making money out of it.
Anybody else?
When you're teaching at the college, is this part of one of your lectures, or is this part of one of the courses?
I can't put it quite so bluntly.
Because I guess the question would be, if you were giving this speech in front of any gathering of, say, 5,000 to 10,000 people, probably 90% of them would figure you were high, or you had some type of agenda, because what you are saying to them goes against everything they've been taught in school, everything they absorb from the media, everything they hear, pretty much. And it's how do you break through the why things are being done versus the acceptable reason for why things are being done?
That's a very good question, and I think the answer is like multifaceted. One part of it is that if I'm teaching, I have to go like bit by bit, and that makes it much easier to swallow. So if you start teaching a class and you're teaching, let's say I teach a Western Civ class, which is essentially a glorified European history class. The students don't know why it's called that. They don't know why you're studying someplace to the east of us and it's called Western Civ, which is Europe. But I kind of teach the class as an origins of capitalism class. And then you can go bit by bit. If you say in the 1600s, this is how capitalism was born, then people are like, okay, yeah, they didn't know that. And then you take it step by step by step, and people, my students in general, are more or less accepting of it. A lot of my students will argue with me, and that's actually okay. I mean, I want them to argue with me. I don't want to make them disagree with me. I want them to draw their own conclusions. As far as with broader groups, I usually will make one of these points and not both, which makes it a little bit easier. But it's okay. I don't mind being considered a little bit crazy.
Okay, it would seem that you're like preaching to the choir here, but how does this message, how can we spread the word to the regular guy or people who just come home, I worked all day, I'm going to watch some crap on television, go to bed, and the next day it starts all over again. So what are we to do? And then I can't wait for the reality show that's the 2016 presidential Republican candidates debate. And they're all like, and the Koch brothers have set aside $1 billion to elect the guy that was, what chance have we got?
I think we have a lot of chance because I think actually most people are getting screwed by the system. And I
Right, so
think
what do
people
we
know that.
do?
I think we talk to people we know. I think people kind of know. I don't quite agree. I think people do kind of know. Do people know all this? No.
No, well,
Do
that would be
people know,
very
like-
helpful if they did.
It would. But do people know, like, my boss sucks? Yes. And
Yeah, I
like,
worked for 30 years for a printing company. I know what that was like.
okay, I mean, and people know, like, I hate paying my city taxes, and people know, oh man, I'm scared of the cops, and that's kind of weird. Aren't they supposed to protect me? But really I'm scared of them, because everybody's afraid of the cops, right? You see a cop car pull up behind you, who thinks, oh yay, here's these guys here to help and protect me? Nobody thinks that, right? People think, oh no, what did I do? Am I gonna go to jail, right? And if you're like a middle-class white person like me, who wears a button-down shirt to work, I still think that. And it doesn't take a big leap to think, oh, if I'm like an 18-year-old black kid, no matter what I'm doing, I'm gonna think that a million times worse. Right, they're gonna kill me. So I think people kind of know. I mean, I brought my family here. I can talk to my family. They're hippies, it's true. Except for you, Tia. Yes.
I have like an idea that might be an easier way to connect, but it might be a big sticky wicket too, and that is that it seems to me the military, the police recruit from veterans, and that's logical in a way. Okay, they need a job, they come home, they know how to carry a gun, and they know how to assert authority, and there's nothing overtly wrong with that, except that their mission, you know, the police are supposed to serve and protect, they're supposed to have some human relations skills, and some of them have been trained to do that. And some of the police really believe that is their mission. So anyway, bringing that issue out, the fact that the military become police, and they're not retrained, and they come home with messed up heads, is one way for people to kind of get a handle on it. They probably know somebody who's come home from the war and been messed up, right? So would you want that person on the street making decisions with a gun? Would you really want that person out there? And I'll bet that's what a lot of this is coming from. Another thing I want everybody to know is that Larry, my friend Larry, who has been harassed by the police on many occasions, he's a big viewer of the scene, and he saw an interview with a Ku Klux Klan guy, and he cannot remember who it was, but it might have been David Duke, and it was in the 90s. And this guy, whoever he was, declared that the Klan would try to insert itself in every level of society. They would try to become judges, become police, become lawyers, and they would be politicians, and they would be all through the system. So if you see overt racism, I mean, you can take the history and go back to the white citizens' councils and the posses in the South, where the police, the sheriffs, were often found among those with the white hoods. So that metaphor, I think people do understand.
Yeah, I think DuPage County has one of the highest per capita incomes in the country, and it also, I think it's about 95% white.
Much less now. It was at one point.
Okay, maybe 90%. So it's we have a huge problem with segregation in this area, which has a lot, I mean, that's an economic issue. Even if you subtracted race 100%, it would still be an economic issue. I'm really interested to hear from someone who actually, I don't know if you live in DuPage County, or what people, how do they view it from that vantage point? What does it look like from over there? You know, because when you're in a mixed or, you know, racially segregated area that has poverty and high crime, it looks different. So I'm curious what people think from that.
You hear a lot of weird things. I mean, my
Yeah,
students,
you do.
you know, I'm teaching in a community college, so like the rich kids tend not to go there. So I get more the working class kids from DuPage County, not universally though, but they have, actually it's become much more diverse, but it's still totally segregated. And they use all these kind of code words that I don't really even know because I don't live there, and I don't plan to live there. But like they know if you mention this town, that's like the rich white town. You mention this town, that's where the Mexicans live. You mention this town, that's where black people live, and they all know that. And when they talk among themselves, they'll even say like, some town I've never heard of is ghetto, and I'm like, I kind of doubt it, you know? Like West Chicago really is ghetto? I don't know, I've never been there and I don't plan to go, but maybe, you know, I kind of doubt, maybe it is. But they have this very also strange fear of the city. Like I had a student who was like into art, and I was like, oh, you've been to the Art Institute? She's like, oh no, I'm not allowed to go to the city. It's dangerous. I'm like, the Art Institute's really not dangerous. but they have, you know, but then you also have you also have a lot of people who are not like that at all. And you have people who have, you know, gone to relatively mixed high schools and who are much more okay with lots of different diverse people. And actually, the college is relatively diverse. It's probably 55%, 60% white, but it's nowhere near 80% white, the students. And the students kind of mix in classes, and there's segregation like in many schools, like there's one part of campus where a lot of black kids hang out. But it's not as different from here as you might imagine from the outside, or at least it's not as different as I thought it would be when I got the job.
I think you had a question, Steve?
Oh, no.
Okay.
It's sort of a comment, listening to your speech, it made me think of some old friends of mine that I spent a lot of time working with, who would really like what you said, and they would then go to the step and say, well, it's clear where you laid out the connection, and you did it beautifully, you know, the connection between the exploitation and the violence abroad and the violence here, that we need to have a revolution, destroy capitalism, and establish communism. And
I'm convinced.
So, you know, I don't do that anymore. You know, various reasons, but even so, it's possible for people to resist and to fight back, you know. And so I think of the Ferguson. And I think it was the young, I think it was those people in the streets of Ferguson that made, to the extent, you know, police violence is a concern of people, you know, even President Obama, you know, expressed some concern. It was those young men and women who did that. They made the difference precisely because they fought back. So that's, and then going to another extreme, to another end of the spectrum, so to speak. Here in Beverly, we, you know, a number of racial incidents, and most, you know, a lot of us here were involved in this, you know, a lot of, not in a racial incident, but in dealing with it, you know, a number of racial incidents in and around Beverly, Mount Greenwood. We had a peace and unity, I guess you could call it that, I don't know if that's what we really call it, peace and unity march, and you know, had a nice turnout, and was integrated and young and old, mostly old like me, you know, but not entirely. So it's possible for people to make, and you say, well, it's still here, and I suppose, you know, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it's like this is what you have to do. You know, you see, you have to do what you can, and so the people in Ferguson did one thing. Well, I'm not doing that, what they did, you know, that ain't happening. But I can do a little bit, whatever it's within my grasp, within my framework. Oh, and also, could you say something about the police in 1937?
Sure. The Memorial Day Massacre, is that what you're talking about?
Right, and there's going to be a function. Do you know about the function on May 16th, 2 o'clock at Avenue O and 117th Street. And they're going to be commemorating what he's going to be so kind.
Sure. I mean, the Memorial Day Massacre, there was a big strike. First of all, in the 30s, workers won the unions. And we get mistaught this story as FDR was nice and gave workers the unions. That's just whatever, BS, whatever you want to call it. I mean, workers fought very hard to win the unions. They went on vast strikes. Sit-down strikes in Michigan were the most important of those. U.S. Steel gave in to a union after the Flint sit-down strike in auto because they didn't want to strike. But the little steel companies, which were Bethlehem, Inland, etc., they refused. So there was something called the Little Steel Strike, where workers in all the other steel mills went on strike. And in Chicago in 1937, they had a big picnic on Memorial Day, actually. It wasn't even a big strike event. Police came and shot down a bunch of strikers. I forget the number. 10?
Right.
And I think there's now a plaque commemorating it at, I think it's a Cermak Produce or Pete's Fresh Market in the parking lot.
The Union Hall is still there.
Right, but the plaque is in the middle of a parking lot. But it's still true that people made a big fight. And what happened in the result of the 30s is, despite the repression, I'm going to follow up on what you said, workers in this country did not make a revolution, but they did throw the capitalists really back, and they were really scared of workers for a long time. And what happened was we had a 30-year period when the standard of living of workers was really much better. And that's not because FDR was nice, it's not because of the New Deal, it's not because the government decided to help workers out, it's because people made a huge fight and refused to accept anything else. So I am totally for a revolution. I'm not afraid of the word communism. But I think that even before that, you can't go from here to there. You need to go from here to people actually making a fight. But if you think about what it would take to actually throw these people back, like what happened in Ferguson was pretty big compared to anything we've seen for a while, but pretty small compared to the power of the police and of the capitalists in this country. And when you think about what it would take to actually throw them back, it would take a lot. It would take a lot. That's why I'm actually uncomfortable using the word movement when people talk about these small fights, because I think they're not quite a movement. You know, the 60s is a movement. Like the Fight for 15, I'm all for it. But I'm not comfortable calling it a movement. It's a small thing. We need to build a movement. Maybe we'll get there, but...
Tony.
Yeah, I have a question. You said something racial. You said taxes. You know that? That's racial. Did
Okay.
you know that? You said code words. That's a code word.
It is.
Taxes. I don't want my taxes raised to help black people. That's a code word, because I talk to certain people every day.
Yeah.
And just like you said about downtown, we all carry guns downtown. That's what they think.
Yes.
But no, they carry phones. I was lost one time and trying to get to the station. There, you know, and this guy should have been scared. No, he's on his cell phone. And I had to almost grab his hand. I said, hey, where is LaSalle Station? You know, like, get away from me, you know. I said, hey, you're supposed to be worried of people because you're carrying a $300 cell phone. But it's not all, you know, it's like that TV at 6 o'clock. What do we see at 6 o'clock? A black man, don't we?
Yep.
At 6 o'clock every day. And every day that goes into your brain. Black man, black man, black man. Now it's kind of reversed. Like you say, you're scared of police too, you know. I mean, before you probably weren't, but now you are, because it does get in your mind. You're stopping people. I don't know if this policeman had a bad day. Did his wife say something to him, or his kids, or what? And that's, you gotta look, and they're human too.
Right.
When you go out there and, hey, you don't feel like getting stopped, hey, why you stop me? Hey, you know, you never know.
Apropos of, you know, the movement and the lobbying thing, do you know who represents you in the Illinois General Assembly?
I looked it up once, but I can't remember. It's Acevedo? Okay.
Well, I asked that because we are all asleep at the wheel, and that's why we have the systems that we have, because we are asleep at the wheel. Does anybody here know who represents them in the General Assembly?
I sure do.
Yeah.
Good.
I know who's supposed to.
Well, have you ever heard of Vote Smart? I got the phone number and the URL for Vote Smart, and you can enter your zip code. It will tell you every single person from the president to your some person who works in the General Assembly. And contact those people frequently, because ALEC, you know what ALEC is, the American Legislative Exchange Council, works in every state. And there's where we get the, you know, the SBCs. Well, you know, that merger with,
Comcast.
yeah,
Comcast.
and it went south. Why? Because there was a big movement against
People
that.
protested.
Right. So things can change if we get together.
But why don't people know who represents them in Springfield and in Washington?
Because we're too busy drinking beer and watching TV.
I don't agree. I actually think it's because people know it doesn't matter. I think people are correct that it doesn't matter. Like, I would have voted for Ulysses S. Grant in 1868, but I would not have voted for a Democrat or Republican since 1868 because they both serve the same people. Like, look at the city of Chicago. You got Mayor Emanuel. You got before him Daley. If there's anything noticeable change, it gets a little bit worse every time. But look what's happened with Obama in office versus Bush. We have just as many wars. Now it's drones more. you see what's happened with the
That's
police.
cynicism.
It's not cynicism, because
That
I'm
is
actually the most
cynicism.
hopeful person that I
Yes,
know. Because I think
Somebody
we
else?
can change it. Sorry,
Yes,
I
we have
don't.
another question.
You have tenure?
Yes. They do want to destroy it.
Okay, well, I guess I'm piggybacking on what Janice said. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Chicago for 35 years. And, you know, there was some kind of a meet and greet this morning at Starbucks at the Jewel in Marionette Park. Okay, so I went there and, you know, information was exchanged. But, you know, these cuts, like you said, are going to be, let's see, catastrophic, I guess that's the word. They're cutting services for persons of disabilities, all types, and et cetera, mentally ill and all this kind of stuff. So we're going to have more problems, and the group in Springfield, you know, I'm a rich person, I don't care. But the only thing I can tell people in this room is to, you know, write or call your elected officials and tell them about the cuts. I'm concerned about A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z, or whatever it is, you know, cuts that are going to happen. And, you know, there are people who, let's see, I don't want to make these boundary lines, but they have Monique Davis and Emil Jones, and there was a committee meeting last Sunday, and this particular person says, well, my state representative and state senator are non-existent, okay? But I mean, the only thing I can tell you to do is to call them.
Yeah, Bill.
One thing you haven't mentioned, and I just want to mention, we've got some sheets over here with some links about what I'm going to ask. We haven't talked at all about the militarization of the police, not just hiring ex-military to be police. I mean, that's something that is done in every level of government. You know, it's a preference thing in some places. It's codified as veterans get preference or a certain number of points on hiring lists. But one thing was fairly obvious from Ferguson, and that a lot of us saw when we went to the NATO march downtown, is how heavily militarized the police are, and even in very small towns and school districts, there is Pentagon money available for mine-resistant vehicles, for tanks, for 100-round magazine M16s, which is pretty heavy-duty stuff. And do you touch on that at all, as far as they're basically taking tactics that they are learning to fight a war overseas and bringing them here?
Yes. I mean, I think it's like an obvious question. Who are the police arming against? And it is not the Canadians or the Al-Qaeda people. It's the people who are sitting in this room, and especially it is against black people. I mean, but it's against the population, and that's, I think it's important to see. This is why I'm not going to vote for the two parties, because it's exactly the same under both of them. They're arming people against us, so that's why I think we need to form our own political organization on a different basis. But
We'll let Mark go first.
Well, then connected to what Bill said, this whole thing with the militarization, it appears that, you know, it's important to go from some bad guy kind of one to the next, from Hitler to Stalin to, you know, Osama bin Laden, and also we have to mix in there the whole the whole mentality about fighting street gangs, you know, and whether it's Al Capone or Jeff Fort, or, you know, that there's this continuity going through the whole process, it appears. Now, I don't know if you'd like to talk about that. Is that some of it feeds on the fears that a lot of people have about crime and violence, you know, so that they are able to put the whole thing of violence on, you know, criminals or street gangs or people who have bad character rather than the system that they're in.
yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, what do you expect to have in a society that grinds up so many people? You're going to have some violence. and you're going to create murderers, and you're going to create people who are actually dangerous to their communities. And the only answer that they give to us is this military force, the police. And that's kind of crazy. I mean, if you just took a step back and said, okay, what do we need to stop having so much crime? It's not so hard to actually imagine. You could do with less money all kinds of things to make sure that children had a future and they didn't think what Michael Brown's moms thought. But instead, the answer they give us is, be afraid of these people. I mean, one of the things, I'm sorry, I have to do it. I'll give you an example which I hate, which is the show Criminal Minds, sorry. But in this show, I don't know if you guys know what show I'm talking about.
Right.
This is like this show. The FBI are good guys, and there are these serial killers out there, and they're just deranged people.
Right.
Okay, and you can see this on almost any TV show. That's just not how the world works. There's not all these just randomly deranged people out there. There are lots of really dangerous people out there, but they're not just randomly deranged. They're deranged because they went to prison and they were abused in prison and come out of it. Or they're sent to Iraq and they get